Throughout World War II, the Republic of Ireland maintained a public stance of neutrality, referring to the conflict as the emergency, and insisting that it stayed removed from the brutal machinations of global warfare. Yet, upon closer examination of historical evidence and lesser-known events, an alternative narrative emerges, one that strongly contests the claim of neutrality. This film argues that Ireland's neutrality was, in reality, a carefully crafted myth, one underpinned by a series of covert actions and political maneuvers that aligned it much more closely with the Allied powers than its official position suggested. By scrutinizing some little-known facts from the time, including the strategic use of the Donegal corridor, the mobilization of Irish citizens in Allied forces, cross-border humanitarian assistance, and secret contingency plans such as Plan W, we can piece together a textured understanding of how Ireland's wartime policies betrayed its public claims of impartiality and exposes the complete myth of Ireland's so-called World War II neutrality.
At the onset of World War II, the newly independent Ireland was still defining its national identity and forging its role on the international stage. Officially, the Irish government, led by Taoiseach Eamon de Valera, pursued a policy of neutrality, a stance that was rooted in a desire to solidify sovereignty and avoid the destruction that had so recently devastated the island during its own struggle for independence. The Declaration of Neutrality represented not only a concrete policy shift, but also a profound ideological statement, a pledge to stand apart from the political alliances that had split the world during the conflict. However, as the war unfolded, it became increasingly evident that pure neutrality in times of global conflict is as much a matter of rhetoric as it is of practical policy. Many nations, it seems, self-limit their public narratives while engaging in hidden cooperation meant to secure their national interests. In Ireland's case, the ostensible neutrality was juxtaposed with a series of actions that, although not overtly waging war, unmistakably hinted at a deeper alignment with the Allied cause. The following film utilizes some little-known facts from the epic to illustrate how Ireland's clandestine behaviors contradicted its official narrative. The evidence of the proclamation of neutrality was a complete and absolute utter myth.
Arguably, the first and most telling indication that Ireland's neutrality was more a facade than reality is encapsulated in the idea of neutrality with a twist. While public declarations and official documents consistently affirmed neutrality, behind the scenes, Irish authorities engaged in measures that disproportionately aided the Allied war effort. For instance, despite the government's insistence on non-involvement, intelligence sharing, and the transmission of crucial meteorological data occurred regularly. These exchanges not only informed Allied operations, including the meticulously planned D-Day landings, but also underscored an alignment of interests. Ireland's assistance in areas that were not immediately obvious to the casual observer reflected a nuanced strategy, one in which retaining the facade of neutrality allowed Ireland to avoid direct military confrontation while simultaneously engaging in actions that benefited the Allies. This duality is at the core of Ireland's precarious balancing act during World War II. While the government's pronouncements painted a picture of impartial observance, the underlying political calculations were motivated by an understanding that, geopolitically, a collaboration, albeit covert, with the Allied powers could significantly bolster the security and economic interests of the fledgling state. The practical implications of this dual stance, however, were not merely abstract. They had tangible consequences on both the military and humanitarian fronts.
A particularly striking example of Ireland's deviation from strict neutrality is found in the utilization of the Donegal corridor. This narrow strip of Irish airspace, which allowed British Allied aircraft to traverse through Irish territory, represents a critical point of evidence in the argument against Ireland's proclaimed neutrality. Though officially the corridor's use was dismissed as an accidental breach of neutral airspace, declassified records and subsequent historical studies indicate that this corridor was a deliberate concession to facilitate Allied military operations. The passage enabled Allied aircraft to undertake reconnaissance flights and patrol missions in the North Atlantic, significantly enhancing the operational capabilities of the British Royal Air Force. In effect, The corridor functioned as an unacknowledged logistical support channel to the Allies, a channel that would have been unimaginable if Ireland were truly committed to a policy of non-interference. The decision to allow the passage of British aircraft was a tacit admission that Ireland recognized the strategic necessity of supporting the Allied war effort, a fact that further undermines the narrative of unwavering neutrality.
Another compelling point of contention lies in the participation of thousands of Irish citizens in the Allied military forces. Despite the government's insistence on remaining detached from the hostilities, approximately 70,000 Irishmen enlisted in the British Armed Services during the war. This significant mobilization of manpower reveals an internal contradiction. If the nation were genuinely neutral, then why would so many of its citizens choose to fight alongside the very powers that Ireland publicly distanced itself from? This phenomenon can be attributed to multiple factors, not least of which was a sense of shared cultural and historical ties that transcended political boundaries. Many Irish citizens viewed the fight against Nazi Germany as a moral imperative, one that eclipsed any formal governmental edict concerning neutrality. Their voluntary involvement in Allied campaigns in North Africa, Italy, and elsewhere can be interpreted as an outright repudiation of the state's official stance. The actions of these volunteers suggest that on a grassroots level, the Irish people were inclined toward the Allied cause, an inclination that was starkly at odds with the government's declared position. The paradox here is instructive. The government's insistence on neutrality can be seen as an attempt to placate international pressures and preserve sovereignty in a world increasingly dominated by great power conflict. Yet, the individual decisions of tens of thousands of Irish citizens spoke a different language, one of active participation in the fight against fascism. In many ways, this divergence between official policy and popular sentiment provides the clearest reflection of the underlying truth, that the neutrality proclaimed by the Irish state was more a matter of political expediency than of genuine isolation from global conflict.